Have you been affected by a smaller budget, less outbound resources for pipeline generation, or has your company been thinking about returning to office in 2024? If the answer is yes, stay tuned because my good friend Matt Green, the CRO at Sales Assembly, is going to share his thoughts on those 2024 sales trends coming up next. Well, Matt, super excited to get into it with kind of your view on 2024 and the state of sales. Before we kind of jump into some of the questions, share a little bit about you, the Sales Assembly, and kind of a little bit about who Matt Green is.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. So Sales Assembly, my partner Jeff and I, we launched this back in 2017. What we do is we provide skills training for the go-to-market teams, sales and post-sales of a few hundred B2B software companies as of today. Prior to that, worked in sales leadership in a couple startups here and there. Go way back into the Wayback Machine, actually worked in wealth management and investment banking prior to fall into this sales leadership realm within the startup world.
Amazing. Well, I think, yeah, that's exactly why we got you on. I think that viewpoint is super unique, super powerful, for some of the folks that are kind of wondering what's going on outside of their four walls. So let's jump into it. One of the lighter yet more serious topics, I think, is return to office, right? RTO. We're hearing this quite often in the enterprise space, maybe not as much in SMB mid-market, but curious to what your hot take is simply on, is making employees return to the office a good idea or bad idea, and why?
I think the devil's in the details nuance, right? Making people not going to go over well, giving them the optionality to return to the office. That seems to be much more popular these days. From a employee perspective, we talk with a lot of individuals that might be looking to join potential B2B SaaS companies in the future at all different levels. SDRs, VP and C-level leaders, and I always, when I'm having conversations with these folks, I always make sure to ask them a question like, "Hey, if you were to find the ideal role, would there be an office location close to you?" Right? And everyone, of course, instinctively says like, "Nah, I'm fully remote. That's what I want." But when you ask that question, good 90% of them, at least in the conversations that I have, they say, "Well, yeah, I mean, of course, I'd like to be able to go into the office a couple days a week." Right? So I think it's important for leaders to realize that, by and large, not universal, but the vast majority of individuals probably do have some inclination to return to the office. They just don't want to be forced into that type of situation. How can you make sure that you're creating an environment where people actually want to go to the office? I think that you need to start from a standpoint of just understanding that if people want to go to the office, it's about the people, not the place. Right? It's not about like, no, come to the office because we have the office. You have to make sure that you're being intentional about creating environments that are going to be much more social and collaborative in nature. Give people as individuals, the motivation, the reasoning behind, hey, here's why I'm actually excited to go into the office today, because I know I'm going to be productive to an extent that I probably wouldn't be able to be if I was sitting here at home. I know that it's going to be a lot of fun because I'm going to be collaborating with other people that I enjoy being around. And again, just building in that level of flexibility where it's not mandated. From what we're hearing right now, that tends to be the recipe for success.
Nobody likes being mandated to do anything. I think doubling down there, you talked a little bit about some of the, like, being flexible, right? Really trying to understand how your employees work the best. But what advice do you have then for an organization that has kind of made that decision to fully return to the office? Like, what are some tips or things you think they should do to have the most success to avoid attrition and turnover?
I think that number one, the big one, is continuing to provide some level of flexibility. Even if you do have this hybrid structure in place, if individuals have family obligations or, they wake up one day, it's like, hey, you know what, not really feeling like coming in today. It's a 45-minute drive, whatever the case may be, making sure that you're being flexible in that regard without giving away the farm. I think that the best way to motivate people to return to the office is to give them some type of reason to do so, some type of work-related reason that involves some type of social component. We do see a lot of companies that have had success with this, and understanding, of course, that not every company has these types of resources, but a lot of companies have redesigned how they've structured their office, the layout to make it more of an experience. So it's less about coming in cubicles, but it is more about providing an environment where people are going to be able to really leverage that social component, right? Where they are going to be able to collaborate, be productive, and do so in a capacity that they wouldn't be able to do if, again, they were sitting within their spare bedroom or down in their basement. So providing those types of opportunities and being intentional about it, again, I think that's how you're going to motivate more people to be willing to buy into a hybrid type of environment.
I like personally moved to Nashville from Buffalo, New York, because I was fully remote and I wanted to go into the office, right? I was seeking that kind of environment. But I also know in the same vein, if I was forced to come in here 5 days a week, it probably wouldn't jive. So I definitely love your answer there. Let's jump around to, another kind of hot topic. A lot of companies are thinking about 2024. 2023 was crazy, and people remember the end of 2022. With companies doing RIFs, you had the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. There's just a ton of change in kind of the SaaS world. Over here, we're hearing from a lot of PEs and VCs that they want their portfolios focused on retention and expansion and less on that cold outbound approach. Kind of curious, what are you hearing out there, Matt?
We're hearing that retention and expansion, especially, is definitely number one right now. New logos, however, at the same time, I mean, are obviously going to be still important. I think that, what you said right there, taking that cold outbound type of approach, like, yeah, that is not working, hasn't been working all this year, and chances are is going to continue to not work into 2024, if not indefinitely. So yeah, high level headline, I agree. Retention and expansion is going to continue to be the name of the game. You see a lot of companies that maybe earlier on, traditionally you see companies that tend to split off just renewals and upsell and expansion. Once they get to maybe, the 10, 15, $20 million mark, you see a lot of companies starting to do that at a much earlier stage from a revenue perspective, just because they do realize the opportunity there. They realize that it is, in many cases, a very different skill set to renew and manage customers as it is to actually identify and capitalize on additional revenue opportunities. But outbound is definitely not dead. It's just going to be really the variety of outbound, the variety of sales motion that you put into place, because people are forecasting the churn is still going to be higher than they want it to be. Budgets, are nowhere near to the extent that they were in 2021 or early 2022. So making up for any attrition on the logo side has to be augmented by new members, or I'm sorry, by new logos, I should say, or else these companies are just going to end up spinning in circles.
Often, I think about like a turtle, right? When these economic shifts happen, a company kind of turtles, goes into their shell for a little bit, but needs that like net new motion to exist in order to come back out and not, stay stagnant, like you said. What's one thing that you should or should not be doing right now with your outbound pipe generation motion?
What we see a lot of companies investing in that is working well. You start with this high level concept of personalization and separating yourself. What is the best way to do that? A lot of companies are really investing in getting back in person, and not necessarily just, hey, let's sponsor this big conference, right? But let's do maybe like mini road shows, right? Let's do these small intimate events with both clients and prospects in different cities around the country so that we can have that face-to-face time. A lot of companies, they are really starting to pivot much more towards an ABM type of motion, where it's like, hey, let's pick a list of, no, here's our top 50, our top 100 accounts, and let's get really creative. Sure, let's craft some hyper-personalized messaging and let's use that as our foundation, but let's spin up a new podcast, right? And let's invite, the CEO or some other executive level decision maker within this target account to be a guest on the podcast, just as a way to sort of open up a warm relationship. Things like gifting, doing it in a creative way. Again, when you put all these pieces together, it goes back to that headline of just, again, increased personalization combined with how do you separate yourself from everyone else, but it's also thinking the same thing. How do we get increased personalization? How do we separate ourselves? And I think that's really where that in-person component, especially, is going to be a big focal point for those sales and marketing teams.
Standing out from the noise. There's so much noise now. I think it's super important. We were at Pavilion's conference a few weeks ago, and there was a stat that showed only 38% of people are doing events, right? So only 38% of companies are actually going in person. And I think like, damn, right? 90% of people are doing inbound, 80% are doing outbound. Like, where are you going to be where your competition isn't? I love that you said that. We're going to round it out from the CRO perspective with budgeting and planning. So really interested to hear what you think about the great tech stack reduction is happening or has kind of happened already where companies kind of took a hard look at all of the tools that they have historically bought just because that's what companies do when you get around to funding and have really cut and ripped out those nice to have pieces of technology and brought on tools that they may have needed. But what's one mistake companies are making when they evaluate their tech stack in general?
Yeah, I think maybe not being only looking at a course spend cost, not taking a close enough look at second and third order effects if you were to rip something right out, the change management component. I mean, sure, if something is just purely shelfware, no one's using it, no one's touching it, sure, feel free to cut that budget. But even when you take a look at, of course, many companies are platforms now that they offer, hey, forecasting and call recording and, outreach sequencing and all these different things. And it's easy for a rev ops or a finance leader to look at one of these platforms and say like, okay, well, sure, their bread and butter is this one component, but they probably do everything else good enough. Not getting the feedback directly from the end users, right? And again, thinking through what that change management is going to look like if we do something as simple as, replace this, call recording and analytics software with this little add-on that this other platform has that, again, probably does it good enough, but not really taking the temperature of the actual users. That does create a whole lot of friction, a whole lot of headaches, a whole lot of lost productivity that actually ends up, costing the business more than what a, probably likely would have been heavily negotiated discount, right, on that renewal would have been. I think that's another opportunity that some of these finance and RevOps leaders might be missing right now is just the degree of which companies are going to be bending over backwards just to keep their business.
Our CEO here was telling this story about our personal tech stack evaluation. And like you hear the term ROI 10,000 times in our world. And I don't think once we brought up an ROI calculator when we started our search. We said, can you do your job effectively without this tool?
Yeah.
Right. If you can't do your best job without this tool, we need to take a harder look at it than just, an ROI calculator. So I like what you said there, getting the feedback from the end users, because that could really change 1,000 different things in the machine. Last question. You talked about it a little bit earlier when we were talking about pipe gen and how that changes the spray and pray is dead. How should companies that receive a round of funding change their spending strategy going into 2024?
Traditionally, in this ecosystem, you raise a Series A, let's say, and the plan is, well, here's how we're going to get to a Series B, right? It was just like this endless hamster wheel kind of motion. And I think that, CEOs that are out there raising money right now, especially trying to raise a Series A, this type of thinking is going to be forced on them by the VC. It's not about raising the A to get to a B. It's about raising an A, then like, okay, here's our path to break even, or maybe here's our path to profitability. There has been just across the board, a very fundamental structural shift in what VCs are going to be looking for when they invest in companies and the expectations that they're going to be setting, which, as you mentioned at the top of the call, when you look back over the past 12 months has resulted in a whole lot of pain, people's livelihoods, layoffs. I mean, it's been a disaster, right? Especially the Q4 of last year and the first 2 quarters of this year. If you take a longer term view of what the end result is going to be, if you hop in the DeLorean and, jump to 3 years from now, it's going to be much stronger and more stable. So purse strings aren't going to be as loose, but the end result is that companies that are receiving their Series A today, they're probably going to be much more structurally sound when you look back 24 to 36 months from now.
Well, Matt, awesome talking with you. Definitely a really great viewpoint and perspective. Man, this was awesome. Definitely appreciate the time.